Hello, Comment229 here, another Topic of the Week video. This is the first topic of 2019, and I'm starting it off right by being a day late. This week's topic is going to be all about Resident Evil 7 and why I don't like it. This week's topic was submitted by YouTube user Crypt Knight, which, by the way, is actually a cool name. And their topic is RE7, a true return to old school horror or just a hyped up facade. RE7's got a reputation for being a return to the kind of games seen in the 90s, and a step up from the past year's games. But is it really true? How does 7 compare to the old-style Resident Evil games, and how does it look next to the rest of the series? Has the writing improved from Resident Evil 6? Is this game's story really fitting as a main numbered title, or does it fit better as a spin-off, as I've heard several critics say? I'd actually go a step further with that last part. Not just as a spin-off, but as an entirely new IP. Like, alright, I hate Resident Evil 7 for a lot of reasons. But I'm not going to say that people aren't allowed to find it scary. If people had fun playing the game, if people had fun and they thought it was scary and they thought it was good survival horror, I don't have a problem with that. That's not what I'm saying. My issues with it are not its quality as a game itself, but its quality as a Resident Evil game and the expectations that come with that. Resident Evil 7 deviates so much from what Resident Evil is, from its story, to its characters, to its villains, to its setting, everything about it, to even the gameplay being a first-person game. Everything about it feels like this was a completely different franchise. This was some new IP. And then they slapped Resident Evil on and then sprinkled in a few things that are kind of vaguely reminiscent of Resident Evil. And then throwing some character that they call Chris Redfield, but is definitely not. And then going, look guys, it connects to the series! No, that's not how this works. I'm not going to say that Resident Evil 7 isn't good survival horror. I honestly don't really care about arguing that. So I don't want people to come and say, well, but how can you not like it? It's a scary game. No, that's not my point. You see, here's the thing about calling it Resident Evil. You have, like, 20 years of game history for Resident Evil. And you can't just completely sever this, whilst also still pretending that it's somehow in continuity. If this was some sort of big spin-off, well, one, they wouldn't have called it Resident Evil 7. Giving a numbered title to something that's a reboot is ridiculous. But if this was just called Resident Evil or Biohazard or whatever, okay, maybe they might be able to, excuse that. But they're trying to play it up as a Resident Evil game. It's not. Just looking at the gameplay, it's a first-person game. There have been Resident Evil spin-offs that have tried this. And I know what some people are going to say, because I've heard a lot of it. Oh, well, originally the games were conceived to be first-person, but then they just didn't do that. Yeah, they didn't do it. And the games have already established their identity as a third-person game. The old style games were the fixed camera angles, and the new style games have the third-person over-the-shoulder camera with various different, tweaks over, like, say, Resident Evils 4, 5, and 6. But it's all third-person. This actually comes with some benefits that Resident Evil 7 does not have. You can look at your main characters. This may seem ridiculous, and this may seem like a completely, almost nonsensical point to bring up. Like, okay, you get to look at them. Well, that doesn't matter for other first-person games like Half-Life with Gordon Freeman. But one of the best parts about Resident Evil was always its characters. Even in the old games, in Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, particularly in Resident Evil 2, even though it was really cheesy and really outdated graphics at this point, you could still get attached to the characters. People cared about Leon, and Claire, and Ada, and Sherry. People cared about, Barry, and Chris, and Jill. People cared about these characters, and one of the things that you get to do is you get to see these characters as you're playing them. And even if it's not something major, even if it's not something you're really thinking about, if you get to see them, you can picture them in your head. Now, who's the main character of Resident Evil 7? I always forget his name because he's such a non-character. Ethan. Ethan? I'm going with Ethan, I think. I think my memory's good enough to remember that. But, like, who is Ethan? What kind of a character is he? He's looking for his wife. And I'm sure there's going to be people like, oh, you know, you can just look up some of his bios. And I have looked up his bio. I've looked him up on the Resident Evil Wiki. And there's nothing even vaguely interesting about him. He's such a bland character. His wife, Mia, I want to say, bland character. The villains? Oh, well, Resident Evil's always had really quirky and memorable villains. Resident Evil 5, which is pretty dumb, has some memorable villains. I remember their Salazar knockoff. And I remember Excella, and you had Wesker, even if Wesker was poorly written. I remember them. In Resident Evil 6, I remember Simmons. I remember Carla. Like, but with the Bakers, you have a franchise that has, for its villains, had mad scientists, people working in shadowy organizations, Wesker, who is both of those. You've had crazy cult leaders, like in Resident Evil 4. You've had, you know, ridiculous, like, you had leaders of global pharmaceutical corporations, and you have all these crazy things going. You have people in the government, like Simmons. You have these crazy, sometimes just outright ridiculously over-the-top villains. And what do we get in 7? Some hillbillies? And that little girl who reminds me way too much of that girl from Fear. Was it Alma? It's been a while since I've even thought about, you know, Fear. But it's like, it just feels like such a severe deviation. The main character isn't memorable. The villains are stupid. And I see a lot of people praise the villains of Resident Evil 7, and I don't understand it. Like, a lot of people will go, Lucas is the only character I absolutely remember the name of, because everyone always praises him, and I don't get it. He is honestly the most obnoxious character in that game, and I hate him so much. I hate him more than the dad character, the villain. You know, just because, oh my gosh, every time I see him on screen, it makes me want to freaking claw my eyes out. He's so obnoxious. And I'm like, I'm wondering, why do people praise him so much? It reminds me of the praise that Tyrion gets in Ruby. Even though he's an absolute garbage tier character who's freaking obnoxious, everyone's like, oh, he's the second coming of Roman Torchwick. No, he's not. And Lucas isn't that interesting. And honestly, even as them being like villains and sympathetic and stuff, them being infected and stuff, like, okay, I won't even dive into all the plot holes, but, you know, just I won't dive into the bad story. I'll talk a little bit about it, but I'm not going to, like, dive deep into it. But, like, I don't care. I don't care about them being sympathetic. I don't even find them intimidating. I honestly find them just laughably stupid. And even as ridiculous as the previous games got, I mean, you had G. Birkin turn into a giant blob monster by the end of Resident Evil 2. That was ridiculous. It's meant to be more ridiculous. It's got that B-movie charm to it. So, the Los Illuminados and Sadler in Resident Evil 4, completely ridiculous. You have this cult leader who's going to use mind control parasites to take over the world. Yeah, that's so over the top. Here we have some family in a swamp, and it's like I'm sorry, I just don't find any of these characters interesting at all. Period. It's some people are going to get mad at me when I say this. Resident Evil 6 was a better Resident Evil game than 7. Yeah. You know why? It's not because Resident Evil 6 is good. Resident Evil 6 is pretty much near the bottom You're right by Resident Evil 7 in terms of the titles of the game, in terms of all the games in the series. But at least it feels a bit like Resident Evil. It's more action-oriented, obviously. That's one of the biggest downfalls of the game, is that it completely takes the action and it ramps it up to over-the-top Michael Bay times infinity levels, and it's like, okay, well, no, it's not. It doesn't really feel like Resident Evil, but it feels more like Resident Evil because it feels like it's trying to at least connect to Resident Evil. You have all the games in the series that follow. You have a handful of characters that you follow across the series. You have Chris and Jill and Claire and Leon. You've got Ada and her involvement. You had Wesker and his involvement. And even then, you have all these characters across the series that are... because by the time you get to Resident Evil 2, you've basically established all of the main characters of the series, and you just revisit them every once in a while. 3 had Jill. Code Veronica had Chris and Claire, mostly Claire. Then you had 4 with Leon, then Chris again with 5. And then in 6, it's like, okay, you have Chris, you have Leon, we're bringing back Sherry, which is great. And I've already talked about a lot of things I liked about Resident Evil 6. Because despite the execution of that game being abhorrent, there are still things that I like about it. I can't say the same about Resident Evil 7. I don't really care about the characters. Like, for as badly written as Resident Evil 6 is, and I already talked about this, I like characters like Pierce. I like Helena. I like Jake, mostly conceptual, but I do like Jake and the way he interacts with Sherry for the most part. I like the fact that they brought Sherry back as a playable character. And I feel like this kind of gets overlooked a lot. Like, yeah, the game is terrible. But just looking, we have Sherry back. And honestly, in terms of the writing, the way Sherry was written was very good for the most part. I'm honestly shocked. It's like, I like that. I like the characters. When Helena loses her sister after, betraying the U.S. government to save her sister, only to have her sister die, anyway, regardless of what she did, I actually felt bad for Helena. Like, I don't feel bad for Ethan with what happens to Mia. I don't feel bad for the Bakers for what happened to them. Because all of them are non-characters and are just bland and uninteresting. Jake is arguably the worst written character, mainly because of his backstory and how he relates to Wesker, which I do have some issues with that. But I like Jake, and I do think that he has a fundamentally decent character arc of being sort of the jerk with a heart of gold who outright ends up becoming a better person. A little more heart of gold, a little less jerk. Kind of a Han Solo type of character development, but it's like, at least you got that. The story was stupid. The story in Resident Evil 6 is really stupid. But at the very least, it's kind of stupid in a way that you can just kind of laugh at it and go, wow, that was dumb. And sure, I do have issues that anger me about the games and the story. But Resident Evil 7 just, it feels like it wasn't even trying with its story. It's like, you have it you're so discarded. What do I say? It distances itself so much from the rest of the series that it doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game. Resident Evil 4, despite being separated by... It's like, let me bring some comparisons and contrasts to Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is another game that changes a lot about the gameplay. It changes a lot about, the style and the way the game worked. It added more action to it. It sets itself in a completely different location, in the middle of Nowheresville, Europe. And it's like, okay, but it still feels like it connects to Resident Evil. You've got Leon Kennedy. You've got Ada showing up. You have connections with Wesker. You still have things that feel like it makes it connect to Resident Evil. Resident Evil 7 doesn't have that. You have a new character who bears barely any to him. And he's running off into the middle of nowhere to find his dead wife, and wow, you know what? That feels like it's something more related to Silent Hill. Silent Hill and Resident Evil are very distinct in how they handle their stories and their games. But anyway, it's like, okay, a little nitpick about this that I want to say. wouldn't Ethan realize there's something weird going on? And by this point in the series, and you can't ignore the rest of the series when they make references to other games, wouldn't the concept of bioterrorism and the fact that these kinds of monsters and stuff do exist kind of ward people off from just driving out into the middle of nowhere like that to find his supposedly dead wife? You would think. Honestly, wouldn't you report this to the BSAA? Wouldn't someone find out about this? Wouldn't you? And especially because of the attack in China in Resident Evil 6. And as bad as that game is, you can't ignore it as canon if you're moving forward with this canon. The story becomes absolutely baffling because it's like, okay, if you take it in as its own thing, alright, maybe you may be able to squeeze by. But as part of a franchise, you really can't. This type of stuff, it's not like Resident Evil 1 or Resident Evil 2, where this kind of stuff was just totally new. No one had dealt with this kind of stuff before. So everyone was shocked about it. But like, by this point, wouldn't this stuff be just common knowledge? Wouldn't people know about this? You would think. And I've actually seen some people try to say that every single event in the entire series has been covered up. Okay, yeah, you can cover up some stuff. You may be able to cover up Raccoon City, though I don't really know how. I'm sure a lot of people knew about that. You had several survivors from it. But the stuff in Resident Evil 5, the stuff in Resident Evil 6, like, you can't just cover. It's like, it feels lazy. Oh, they just covered it up. Okay, but you have the BSAA, which is an actual organization that handles this. You have TerraSave, a very public group. Like, in Degeneration, they actually show that people know about the virus stuff. The whole thing at the airport with all the zombies. This stuff is public. People know about this stuff. So you can't just say, oh, well, no one knows about it. You can't say it's been 20 years and every single incident that has ever happened in the series has been completely covered up. And if you want to include the rest of the movies, you can look at Vendetta, where you had basically a whole bunch of people in a city get infected and then get healed. You can't just ignore that. And this is what's frustrating, is that you can't have a game like this that completely separates itself, but also relies on the name that it's also trying to separate itself from. It's kind of like when you get to like the Star Wars sequel movies, where it's like you have Resident Evil, but you have Episode 7 and Episode 8, and they're desperately trying to destroy everything in the past, but they're desperately relying on Star Wars and its name. You have them kill off Han Solo. Forget the past. Kill it if you have to. But go watch our movie Solo because we want you to care about Han Solo even though we completely ruined him and then killed him off. And that's the same kind of feeling I get with Resident Evil 7. It's like, no. We're different from the rest. We're not like Resident Evil, but please buy us because we are Resident Evil. If this didn't have Resident Evil in the title, I'm sure it would have done fine. It wouldn't have been anywhere near as successful. I really feel like no one would be praising it as much as they have because, well, there's so much that's not even all that interesting. Another thing that really bugs me, the baker's house. It's like this big elaborate, mansion, and I'm sorry, you can't just pull stuff like this out of nowhere. Some people in the Hodunk South, you just have this big elaborate mansion with all these puzzles. Look, in Resident Evil 1, there's a reason. The Spencer Mansion had a reason. It was designed that way. The quirks. You also have weird stuff on Rockford Island. You have weird stuff that are trying to explain things like in the Resident Evil or the Raccoon City Police Department. You have some attempts at explaining certain aspects of this here and there. Usually because some people are kooky. But usually it's like, okay, you have the Spencer, Oswald E. Spencer, very rich, very powerful man. The Rockfords, rich. Even Resident Evil 4, and you have like the castle and all the stuff that's going on there. Okay, well, it's a castle, and you know the family. You know, it falls into some old, you know, classic tropes about secret passageways and booby traps. But like, okay, you could expect some of that stuff in a video game castle. Some house in the south. It just, I just honestly, of the things that really break my suspension of disbelief, that's one of the things that breaks that. It's just like, okay, this hodunk Southern family has this elaborate mansion, and you're stuck in it. Ethan doesn't leave, and that police officer comes in, and they actually have to teleport, what's his name, evil dad zombie, in to kill that police officer. It's like, everything about it is just so contrived. It's like, okay, you don't get out, you don't, even when you can leave, you don't. And it's like, it's so desperately trying to recreate, you know, it is a lot like The Force Awakens. It's like, we're trying to recreate everything from the first installment. You've got them stuck in a mansion. You've got them investigating something. You know, in this case, it's finding a dead wife, and instead of finding what happened out to Bravo team. But it's like, it's trying to recreate things, but it does everything in a worse way. Sure, the game looks pretty. It really does look pretty. But it doesn't look like Resident Evil. It doesn't play like Resident Evil. And when people hail it as the return to old Resident Evil, I just have to... Just a second. When you got Resident Evil Revelations that already did that, it's like, okay, I'm sorry, but it really annoys me when people forget Revelations, and then they're like, oh, but Resident Evil 7 is the first time this has ever happened. Like, no. No, we got this. We got a game that featured Chris and Jill. It did, in fact, set place on a, you know, you have like the cruise ship as its main location, and you've got scary stuff, while also incorporating some of the more modern gameplay elements. I remember when the demo for this first came out in the 3DS, and I played it. I played the crap out of it. I loved it. And that was just the demo. When you play the game, it feels nice. You've got that tension. You've got the, you know, somewhat claustrophobic areas. But you've also got some of the better controls, so it's like, okay, it felt nice to play. But it didn't have to completely eschew itself or disconnect itself from the franchise. And that's what's neat. It actually takes place. It's Chris and Jill working at the BSAA. We get some new characters, and I know I haven't beaten the game yet, but you know, from the story, it at least feels like it tries to be a Resident Evil game without completely separating itself and only throwing in weak connections. Like, oh, here's Chris working with Umbrella? How does that even work? Umbrella was shut down. This is explained in Resident Evil 4. The government, after years of trying to fight legal battles, they ended up completely shutting, Umbrella down. Now I'm hearing people say, oh, well, this is a Umbrella coming back to redeem itself. What do you mean redeem itself? Umbrella's done. Anyone who had anything to do with it has left. It's like you actually have cutscenes in, I believe it's Resident Evil 0, with Wesker and, yeah, it is Resident Evil 0, with Wesker and Birkin, and them talk about it, and Wesker outright calls Umbrella a sinking ship, because it was. He saw the writing on the wall, and he went in and took the Umbrella stuff, because especially if you play stuff like Umbrella Chronicles, you have some of the side stories, and what was going on with Umbrella, and what Wesker did, and what Chris and Jill were going out and trying to, stop Umbrella. Yeah, that's why they stopped him. And ultimately, they completely folded by the time of Resident Evil 4. So you can't just pull, like, you had Neo Umbrella in Resident Evil 6. And how are you supposed to, even if this is desperately Umbrella trying to redeem themselves, which is ridiculous, because you can't just redeem a pharmaceutical corporation like this, especially not one that was found to be responsible for so much crap that went on in a zombie apocalypse. It's like, no. Why isn't Chris working with the BSAA? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And when it's trying to connect to the franchise, it completely shoots itself in the foot. Like, this doesn't make any sense. And I don't want to see Chris working with Umbrella. It doesn't make sense. Why not have someone like Hunk working with the new version of Umbrella? Where the hell is Hunk? People like him. But no. That would actually be genuinely good fan service. And this model that they have for Chris, it looks nothing like Chris. It doesn't sound like him. It's like, this isn't Chris. And this is a problem that goes for Chris across multiple different versions. Because if you look at him from Resident Evil 5 to 6, Vendetta, and 7, he looks almost totally different in each one. I mean, shoot, the one in Resident Evil 6, you could actually edit his hair. If you change his hair to be spiking up a little, sort of like he had in Resident Evil 5, he wouldn't look that bad, but it's that stupid hair. It looks like his hair is all pressed down, and it's like, no, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good on Chris. And he looks so generic like that. But this Chris, it's like, it's not Chris. I don't know who that is, but it's not Chris. And it's like, so even if they're trying to connect to the franchise, it feels like an insult. And, you know, when people praise it, it's like, I feel like this is a game that's praised mostly by people who aren't as familiar with Resident Evil, or people who, I was like, I don't understand, like, Resident Evil had issues, but it had its own style. And now we have the stupid mold. I hate the mold and the bugs. It's like, we already did bugs. It was in Code Veronica, and it was done so much better. But it's like, yeah, it eschews the characters that we care about. The one character that we do care about is unrecognizable. The characters are boring. It separates itself so much from the gameplay that it doesn't even feel like it should be called Resident Evil. Because even if Resident Evil 4 was a distinct difference from the fixed camera angles, it still feels Resident Evil. People have actually shown that if you did do fixed camera angles, if you mod the game to have fixed camera angles, the way what am I saying, Chris? Leon moves around, it actually still does work. It still feels like Resident Evil like that. And it's funny, it's looking at the people do that, it's like, oh, that's actually kind of neat. And it shows that it's simply a perspective change. And one that was obviously done to make things a little more accessible. But what Resident Evil 7 does, it almost feels like they threw the baby out with the bathwater. And I have no doubt that, you know, the way they handled Resident Evil 7 was in a way overcompensating for what happened with Resident Evil 6. Oh, well, people were angry with the action. Okay, so let's throw everything out. Let's throw out all the characters that people care about. Let's throw out all the threads and plot lines and stuff that people care about. Let's throw out the settings and themes that people care about. And let's start over from scratch. And then try to copy the original. And it's just stupid. It's like you have to make incremental changes. Because Resident Evil didn't just suddenly turn into RE6 overnight. You didn't go from RE4 being the pinnacle of the series, one of the most popular games ever made, to Resident Evil 6 being hated. You didn't go from that. You had 5 in the middle, which was moving in that direction. Then you had 6. All you need to do is pull back on the action. Render 6 non-canon for all I care. Reintroduce the characters in a better way. But, you know, even if you were just continuing the story, okay, continue the story in a way that makes sense. Take the gameplay enhancements from Resident Evil 6 and work them into a better game. You can look and see with the way that Resident Evil 2 Remake plays and controls. It's like, okay, they can still take the more modern gameplay and work it into a classic survival horror. You don't need to change everything. You don't need to turn it into a first-person game. You can still make a good survival horror game, still a good Resident Evil game. And of course, Resident Evil 2 Remake isn't out yet, so we'll see how it is when we get there. But just from what I've seen, it looks so much better than in Resident Evil 7. And you know what? Part of that really does matter. It looks better. It feels better. It has characters we care about. Sure, it's a new interpretation. Even more so than RE1 Remake was for the original game. But I still feel like I care about these characters more. I care about Leon. I care about Claire. I care about Ada. I care about Sherry. And so when you see them enhance this stuff, but not lose what made Resident Evil, it makes me wonder, why couldn't Resident Evil 6 have been like that? Why couldn't they have done something similar? Taken the gameplay improvements that the series has had, and then work in better game design. Work in a better story. It's like, yeah, Resident Evil 7, it's survival horror. It doesn't take the series back to its roots. You already had an entry that was moving the series back towards more survival horror. Resident Evil 7 is moving too far. There's a difference between separating yourself from the stupid stuff, like some of the ridiculous plot lines of Resident Evil 5 and 6, and then separating yourself from the franchise entirely. I thoroughly believe, like I said in the beginning, that Resident Evil 7 should have been its own thing. If Resident Evil 7 was its own thing, disconnected from everything else, if it was its own game, Scary House in a Swamp, they would have had a better name than that, but like you had this game, and it wasn't called Resident Evil. It wasn't making references to Resident Evil. But you could say maybe it was inspired in ways by Resident Evil. I really wouldn't have any complaints about it. I wouldn't care. And even if the story was just as dumb, I really honestly wouldn't be invested. But I like the Resident Evil games. I like Resident Evil as a franchise. So when I see people forget Resident Evil Revelations, praise Resident Evil 7 as like the new pinnacle of the franchise or the best survival horror game ever, and it's like, no, it's like you can't say it's taking the series back to its roots when it's literally just uprooting the entire franchise and trying to start over. Just properly reboot it at that point. Just do its own thing. But don't try to be a continuation, but also trying to kill the past. I really hope that moving forward, they don't continue with Resident Evil 7 style, but continue with the Resident Evil 2 remake style. Because I would like to see more in that regard, like the way they're handling it there. Where it is, survival horror, but with modern gameplay. So it actually feels like it's part of the series without changing everything. And really, that's ultimately what my problem is. It changes too much. Resident Evil 4 changed a lot, but it didn't change everything. It changed a lot in a good way, because the series, after 4 installments that were very similar, and especially, 3 of them being very, close together, and then you have Resident Evil 0, all of them had a lot of similarities to them. And some of them were kind of beating a dead horse. It's like, yeah, Resident Evil 4 was a necessary shakeup. It needed it. It needed that change. But it changed in a good way. In a good way that benefited the series. And I've said this many times before, the problems of Resident Evil 5 and 6 are not Resident Evil 4's problem. Resident Evil 5 and 6's problem is that they completely misinterpreted why people liked 4. And then when they realized it wasn't working, they swung so hard in the other direction that we end up with Resident Evil 7. And sure, people can like it. If someone says that they loved Resident Evil 7, okay, you know what, fine. Say it's a good game. I don't really care. Even if I don't like it, I don't care. But you can't really say it's a good Resident Evil game because it's barely even a Resident Evil game. RE6 is more Resident Evil than this. And RE6 is the least Resident Evil of all the Resident Evil games. But at least it tried to connect to the series. RE7's just... it's so foreign, and it just doesn't make any sense. It's like, if it was a spin-off, maybe you might be able to go, okay, maybe. Like, you've got some first-person Resident Evil games, but being a mainline game and changing as much as they did, it just... Feels bad, man. Well, I think that's about it for this topic. If you want to submit a topic to me, you can comment below if you're on YouTube, or if you're on Tumblr, send me an ask and put topic : and then whatever topic you want me to talk about. Just make sure to follow the rules that I'll be posting down below. If you want to watch last week's topic video, you can check that out here. If you want to watch next week's topic video, you can check that out here when I get that done. So what are your thoughts on Resident Evil 7? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Do you think it belongs in the Resident Evil franchise? Please comment below. And thank you for watching.